Bueno, es un placer tenerlos a todos aquí esta noche
It's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight.
y ojalá que nosotros podamos compartir con ustedes
And we hope that we will be able to share with you all
algo de nuestro trabajo en América Central.
something about our work in Central America.
Así es.
And that's that. That's all I've got to say about that. We're going to be sharing, and we've got some. Used to carry out slides. You remember everybody used to have slides. Well, we've got some pictures to show you. I was a little limited because when we were on the field, there wasn't digital cameras. And so most all of the film we had, all of the pictures we took are just on hard copies, and some we were able to scan. And so we're going to be sharing with you some of the things. But what we wanted to do tonight was give you a summary. That's better. 11 years on the field. 8 Christmases away from home and family. Now, granted, there was a point in which where we lived felt like home. And so it's not really correct to say away from home, because wherever we were, we made a home from it. We were in 3 countries over a period of 11 years. We were in Costa Rica for a year of language study. We were in Honduras for 2 complete terms. And then we had begun starting our 3rd term in Nicaragua when the Lord brought us back to the States in the year 2000. During that time, we lived in 5 different houses. And I drove 3 different vehicles. Our children were educated with homeschool material, a bilingual school, and 3 journeymen who came and served as teachers for our children. And I wanted to start by saying all of that to say thank you, because your Lottie Moon offerings paid for every bit of it. Paid for our 11 and a half years of us being on the field. Paid for our housing. Paid for our transportation, which I'll be able to show you in just a moment. And I've already given the deacons a little heads up that I'm going to be sharing the only real automobile accident I ever experienced on the field. And it'll be being part of that. But when we talk about Lottie Moon, sometimes you think it's just an offering. We want you to see what your money was spent on about 20 years ago. This is our family. There we go. Towards the end of our 11 years. You can see our children had kind of grown by that time. This was taken just before we went to Nicaragua, and it served as kind of our prayer card for both our work in Honduras and Nicaragua. But we didn't look like that when we went to the field.
Yeah, we were a lot younger then. But I want to share with you just a little bit about our journey as we started out with the kids. At that time, Timothy was 9, Tiffany was 7, and Christina was 4 years old. You know, one of the things we'd always hear from people, about when we talk about going to Central America just after the Sandinista regime, and people were concerned, and they would say, and you're going to take your children with you? They're like, yeah, because they were concerned. We understood that, but we went as a family. But they were young. Children adapt so quickly. And so we started out in Costa Rica, where we studied the Spanish language. Randy had some in high school. I had maybe a couple of classes at Union. And so after the first couple of weeks, man, they covered everything I'd ever studied. So we got there, and our school was totally in Spanish, going to the restroom, doing anything, signs, everything was in Spanish. And that's what, as you pray for missionaries, think about their language learning, because they have to be totally immersed. And I remember those first couple of weeks that we were in language school. The kids, the older 2 were in bilingual school. Christina, the youngest, was like us. She was in a little daycare and totally Spanish immersed. And so I remember those first 2 weeks, and she would come home. They would come home from school, and Christina would sit down with me, and she was 4 years old, and she'd cry, and she'd say, "Mommy, I don't understand." And me being the wise mother, sat it down with her on the couch and said, I know, I don't either, honey. And we'd both just cry because we were struggling. But then we'd go to a church service, and just as Randy said, we'd hear some of these hymns, and the music would sound familiar. And even though the words were different, it was like heaven. And God would reassure us, it's going to be okay, and we're going to take care of it.
Shortly after we got to Honduras, this picture was taken as Ralph, one of our colleagues and mentors, and you'll hear more about Ralph and Sue along the way. He's the tall, lanky, we called him a tall Texas drink. He played the violin, well, no, he played the fiddle. And he was just a delight, and he really took up with our children. In fact, him and his wife became, most of the time on the field, other missionaries were aunts and uncles. They weren't. They were grandparents. And kids called them Nani for the woman and Poppy for the father, for the husband. And when we started having grandchildren, we took those names. Our 11, maybe hopefully soon to be 12 grandchildren will always call us Nani and Poppy in honor of this couple here. They were on the field, had been for a long time before we got there, and they helped me learn a lot of things, and they helped Cindy learn a lot of things as well. I also want to share with you that when we got there, I told you about our transportation. Well, I actually had 3 different vehicles. The first one was a Toyota Land Cruiser. No, it wasn't a horse. We would use the horse when cars wouldn't get us to where we needed to go. There were places that cars couldn't travel, and we'd take horses or mules. And there were places where horses and mules couldn't travel, and we would walk. And that's what you saw us doing going into Raytoka in that first picture. But I had a Toyota Land Cruiser, which is not pictured here. It's one of our earlier pictures. The green Toyota Hilux was mine. And as you can tell from the bottom picture, we often joked when volunteers would come, or we would have nationals go with us to different events. The question would be, how many folks can you put in your mission vehicle? And I said, well, the answer's simple. One more. And every time we stopped, we could pick up one more. And so we, many times that's exactly what we did. When I had the Toyota Land Cruiser, and I wish I had a picture of it, it was like a tank. It was the old style, the one where the back doors opened up and they had in the back fold-down seats, like what a carrier, like a troop carrier type thing. And the kids loved it because they could just fold up the seats if they wanted to just use the whole back. It was great for off the road. It had 4-wheel drive. It had high wheelbase. I could drive over stuff, rocks and things like that. It was murder in the city. I'd go into the Capitol, and it was too big for a lot of the streets. But I can tell you, and this is the story I wanted to tell y'all. Went down to in the Capitol one time. Was driving down a highway that, not a highway, but just a boulevard that had 4 lanes. And I was in the outside lane, and coming down the boulevard, I was coming up to an intersection where there was a guy who was trying to ease his way out. Now, he was in a pickup truck, and he was nosing his way out. And by the time I got towards him, he was almost out in the lane. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm in no hurry. I was feeling the Good Samaritan. I'm just going to stop, let this guy out, and let him get on his way. And so as I did, by that time he was halfway out, and I pulled up to a stop. My daughter, Tiffany, is in the front seat beside me, and we're standing there, or waiting there. As he goes by, he just kind of waves through his side window, and I wave at him and, just tell him, come on, come on. And I'm watching to make sure as soon as his bumper clears my fender, I'm going to head on down the road. So it does, and I do, and the next thing I know, the car behind him starts coming right at us. And there's this horrible sound, and I throw on my brakes, and I look at this guy. He's come right up to the side door. Actually, to be honest, our vehicles never really touched. But he was coming right out after that truck and was going to hit my daughter's door right there. And so I kind of looked through her window, and I gave him one of those, what do you think you're doing? Well, he looked at me through his windshield. He said, in his language, what do you think you're doing? Well, to my surprise, the guy I had just let get by and get out jumped out of his truck. He comes running in. He says, what do you think you're doing? I said, what are you talking about? I let you by. I'm going to go on down the road. Your friend can follow you and somebody else can let me. He says, no. I said, why not? He says, I'm towing him. He had a 9-foot tow line, and I had such a high wheelbase that I didn't see it. And so by the time he got it to where he was stretched out, I still couldn't say it. I drove over his tow line. I pulled the other car to me. And I thought, oh, I'm going to be here forever. The police will never show up. But they did. A policeman came right around. Motorcycle police officer came by. He came by. He wanted to know what is going on here. And I tried to explain in a second language. And I don't know if you've ever tried this before, but there is no legal defense for driving between two cars in tow, even in a second language. And finally he says, but sir, he was towing him. And I said, okay, what do I need to do? And they said, well, you need to pay for the damage. Well, I looked, and none of the cars had hit, but when I ran over the tow line, it had pulled his bumper out, because he had a cable that was locked onto his bumper, so it pulled his bumper out. He says, you'll have to replace his bumper. I said, how much? And the man looked at the bumper, looked at me, and he says, 100 lempira. Now, the 100 lempira was the highest denomination of currency they had at that time. And I said, really? It was worth about $14. And so I quietly found one and gave it to him, handed it to him, said, que pasa un buen día, which in Spanish means, have a nice day. And I went on down the road, leaving him to talk to a police officer. He says, I gave you a gringo and you asked for 100 lempira. What's wrong with you? Got back to our home, and we lived in the country part. We lived down south in the country part, where life was a lot simpler, a whole lot less cars. We had ox carts and goat carts and people on horseback, as I showed you earlier. And it occurred to me something a few months later. When Lottie Moon came around, I decided I need to tell this story. And so I wrote it out, pretty much like I just told you. I didn't hide anything. But I got to the end and I said, you know, when we got back to San Lorenzo, we saw goat carts and ox carts. And it occurs to me there's two ways to travel tied together. One is yoked, where you share the labor and you share the load. And the other's in tow, where one is pulling the other from behind. This year, realize that you and I are yoked in missions, sharing the labor and sharing the load.
I also want to share a little bit about the idea of poverty in the culture that as we lived in southern Honduras, we lived in the poorest country in Central America, and we lived in the poorest area in the poorest country. And so what you're seeing here is a family, and I want to share a little bit more about the children that were part of our Bible class, but they lived in an adobe house with a dirt floor, and we were right next door. And so we lived in a cement block, and you know, it was just that contrast between those that had money and those that didn't. In fact, when Martha's mother passed away, I remember that evening she came over and she asked, could she borrow electric lights so that she could run a line through there and people could come and we could have a vela for her mother's death, and she could wash her and lay her out on the table. So it was going through these things in culture, and so seeing the oxen, seeing the adobe houses, people walking was really the major way to get around. And so we saw that every day. Playing soccer, that was the big entertainment that they had back then. Kids didn't play a lot. They worked very hard from a very young age, and it was often a sight we would see a mother maybe, and she would have 3 or 4 children behind her, and she would have on her head a big basket of tortillas or corn or something, and then her little tots behind her, they would all have their little bowls sitting on top of their head, and they were all being trained to carry their load, or the little boy might have a pack of wood on his back that would be used for their fire. So they learned to work at a very early age. The food was different, learning to get used to eating rice and beans every day. Fish that still had their heads on when it was cooked coming to our plate. But I got to tell you, the food was delicious. It was great. Once I removed the eyes, I was okay, you know. But and the music, And then one of the pictures here you're seeing is one building on our beach that we actually had groups that would come out, and we would have youth gatherings, or when our volunteers come, we would have a day of rest toward the end of their week of work, and we'd go out to the beach and share that with them.
My work consisted mostly of preaching in the churches as well as teaching. And when I say going to the churches, it very seldom would we be in a brick building. And we certainly were never in a brick building that had air conditioning. Most of our services were outside. Now, you can't see too well the whiteboard, but if you had a close-up of this picture, you would see it has two diagrams on it. One, the person of Christ with a man in it, and one, the drawing of a man with Christ in it. And yes, I was teaching you in Christ, Christ in you, even in Honduras. And it's because the teaching and the principles are universal. And so we would do this. I would many times have to travel hours to a location that may only be 20 miles away as a crow flies. But the roads and the condition of the roads just made it to where that's why we had to have those kinds of vehicles. I said also about the Land Cruiser, I had gotten into a lot of mud and a lot of dirt and a lot of places that I didn't know that I would ever get out of, but it always got me out. And I told Cindy, I said, if something happens to me here, honey, bury me in the Land Cruiser. It ain't been in a hole it couldn't get out of yet. Sometimes we would carry volunteers with us on these trips. And over the years, I'm not exaggerating when I said that we've had hosted over 1,000 volunteers during all kinds of projects.
And during the time that Randy would be working with the adults and training maybe the teachers or working with the pastors, depending on what they were doing, depending on the area we were in, I would be working with the children, and it would vary. We would have small to very large groups of children. I would also encourage any of the mothers that were standing around, because many times the youth or the women would be standing around the outer edge listening to these stories. When we were there, it was a little over 40% of the people were still illiterate, especially in the rural area, so they couldn't read or write, which meant a lot of our stories came from Bible pictures that I would hang up to teach from, which I would always encourage teams to bring them from all the churches, your church, other churches, their Bible school pictures, and I could use those pictures and teach the stories. One of the ministries that I was able to begin was in the first town that we lived in, Choluteca, and I remember after getting there and settling in a couple of months, there was a little tap at our gate, and I, still learning the culture, what it was like, and practicing my Spanish. And I remember going out to the gate, and there was this lady, Adriana, and she had about 3 children, 2 around her leg, and then she had Marvin, and he was very malnutrition, and she had him in her arms, and of course, I was just pulling at my heartstrings, Mom here. So I told her that to just wait, and I'd go in the house and get her something to eat. And so I brought her a plate of rice and beans and things that she could eat, and then we sat there and we talked, and I thought, Lord, this is my opportunity, foot in the door. This is what I always dreamed about since I was 10 years old when he called me into missions. I was so excited. And so I told her, I said, Adriana, when you come back next week, why don't you bring some of your friends? Well, she did. She came back with 2 or 3 mothers, and they had 4 or 5 kids of their own. So we had a little group going on there, and I thought, well, okay, Lord, there's something going on. You're doing something here. And within 2 months, we had over 20 families coming to our gate. And so one of the teams that had been coming in several years in a row had said, well, what can we do to be a part of this ministry? We love it. And they started calling it the Gate Ministry. And I said, well, you can maybe leave some funds so that we can buy these beans and rice and put together these bags. And so we were able to do that. And not only that, we were talking to one of the local pastors, and Hermano Eduardo said he would love to have that ministry in his church. And so one of the local Baptist churches took them in and started a Saturday morning class, and they would come to the class, these families would, and they would have children's classes, and the adults were being taught, and then they would receive their food after that. And several other families came to know Jesus Christ through that ministry. So I'm telling you, your prayers, your giving, your going really makes a difference. in what we do. Women's crafts, working with the women, again, doing devotions and Bible studies, and just trying to get them to come alongside us. We're always trying to reach out to the nationals and get them to be a part of the work, because it wasn't about the missionaries' job, the missionaries' project. It was their work, what God was calling them to do. We used puppets, and our children were as much a part of our ministry as any volunteer that came. They were the ones that were behind those puppets many, many times. They would hand out the sheets of that would be colored, and the crafts that would be made. They were right there to be a part of that. And so we would call them, instead of, you always hear the term missionary kids, and we would call ours kid missionaries, because God was using them in mission work from the time they were young, and we were training them. One of the things that I like to do during that training period was to get the children involved in such a way that I would offer them 3 steps that they could go through. And they weren't just learning a Bible verse. You had to learn maybe the 10 Commandments would be 1 step. Then you had to learn the Lord's Prayer. I can't remember, but there were 3. There you go. And so there were 3 steps. Once they accomplished that and they could come to me and do that, then they could earn a Bible. And so it means so much more. And you may want to share a little bit about that.
One of the things about the Bible that was significant, not only for the children, but when we came back on our first furlough and we shared about this work, we had a friend of ours from a church that when we were at Clifton, named Edith Gallagher. And she was just, she was a delightful lady, and she was a prayer warrior. And she would actually write letters to missionaries. She wrote letters to me on the field, encouraging me and saying, I'm praying for you. In fact, God just got me up, and I prayed for you. And not only at the top of the letter was there the date, there was the time. And Joan Gertie is patterned after Edith Gallagher. And Edith Gallagher was my prayer warrior. And so she said, I want these kids to help. I want to help these kids get these Bibles. And she gave us money for the Bibles to help with getting them. And so the first time we had a group that was awarded Bibles, we had each one of them sign a Bible. And I took it back and I presented it to Miss Edith. And she said, I want to be buried with this Bible. Our preaching services, again, the goal is to see souls won for Jesus Christ. And this was one of the few pictures I had of a decision that was made during one of those services that was there. We used volunteers for all kinds of ways. As Cindy has already indicated with children's ministry, she would use them for children's ministry. I used them a lot for construction projects. Now, if you look closely, these are our 3 children as they grow older. This is, in fact, in Nicaragua, right before we were heading back. You can see how big Tim has gotten. That's Tiffany and Christina there to the side, and one of their friends from another missionary family, and Angela, is in between the 2 of them. She's the little blonde that's between the 2. And I tried to help. I even told the deacons this one time. I tried to get on the scaffolds to help when the volunteers would come. Volunteers come with skills that I don't have. That's what volunteers do. They bring skills to the ministry that the missionary doesn't have, and they are able to accomplish things that the missionary can't accomplish. I would try to help them. I would get up on the scaffolds if they were doing some forming of wood or something, and every time I get up there, I think a lot of them were older, older. Yeah. From that period where, you remember when everybody had CB radios in their cars and trucks? And they all talked with that special code, and everything. Well, ever so often, one would look over at me and he'd say, hey, Brother Andy, put the hammer down. I thought he was saying, go, go, go. No, he was saying, put the hammer down. Step away from it, young man. You're dangerous. They called me lightning, not because I was fast, but just because I didn't strike twice in the same place. We also found that maybe one of the best things I could do is just bring them concrete and help them with the jobs that they were doing. We saw them building buildings, and in fact, the wall that this guy's doing right here is actually one of the last Well, actually, this is a mission trip, a volunteer mission trip that we went on later based on some of the work that we did, and Cindy will tell you a little bit more about that. But I want you to see that when volunteers came, they not only brought their skills, they learned skills. They learned how to mix concrete on the ground without a wheelbarrow and without a mixer. And that little volcano that you see, that's sand and mortar mix and water, and they would take shovels and just scoop it in on itself until it ended up as a pile of mortar mix on the ground. The guys with the screens, they're separating sand and gravel. Our volunteers were one of the biggest blessings that we had. And one of the biggest blessings for them was the bonding that they did with nationals. When they were able to make contact with other, not just the children, but with other families, they made friendships. And they found out that God loves the little children of the world.
One of the ministries that, besides the Gate Ministry, that the Lord really blessed us with, when we came back in our second term, we moved to the city of San Lorenzo, which was closer to the Pacific Ocean. And so the poverty there it was just incredible. And so when we got settled in, again, I was, Lord, where do you want me to plug in? You know, I'm here, I'm available, just let me know. Well, I noticed after several weeks that our children were playing with some of the kids across the street, and it always concerned me because I wanted to keep the kids close. You know, I just kind of want to keep an eye on things. It's very different down there. And I thought, well, you know what? They were playing with the kids, and I thought, why don't we just start a Bible club? So I told the kids, I said, invite your friends, and they can come over Friday evening, and we'll have a Bible class. We'll do craft, we'll sing songs, we'll play games, we'll have a great time, and just see what the Lord does with that. Well, they did. They invited their friends. So that first time, we had over 30 children to show up. I thought, okay, Lord, this is good. And I was a little bit surprised. I wasn't sure because I had not made that many copies of the pictures. And I thought, okay, I know you're doing something, because I had learned when God goes in a direction, he's you just hang on, go with it, and he does wonderful things. So we had a wonderful time. And I said, now go tell your friends. Within a month, we had over 300 children in our backyard coming to our Bible class. And so we just, volunteers coming in, working with us, I would write, we'd send letters to them, or make phone calls, say, please bring material in so we can make pallets for them to sit on, because the children, those that did go to school, had uniforms, and I didn't want them to get dirty. And also it kept the fire ants off of us, so we had made pallets for everybody to sit on, and we just had a wonderful time. In that class, God just worked through that, and so many families were reached through that. And one of the children that was reached, her name was Gisela. And I remember one day, and the major religion down there is Catholicism. And so she came to me and she said, Doña Cindy, and that was a term of respect, and she said, my teacher says I don't need to come to your class anymore. Well, I knew she went to the public school. Most public schools down there were Catholic run. And she says, they say you don't teach the truth, and you don't pray to the saints. And I said, well, okay. He said, well, I understand that. I said, I tell you what, first of all, why don't you go invite your teachers to come to my class? Because I knew their Catholic Bibles, they did have more books than I did, but all of what I had is in their Bible. So I knew every story I was telling, they had. So I said, just invite your teachers to come to my class. And I said, then I gave her scriptures to read about how God wanted his people to worship him only, and not to have graven images. I knew that was part of the commandments that she would be reading. I said, well, you go home and read that and come back and tell me what you think. And see, I didn't tell her what she was supposed to believe. I let the Holy Spirit work in her life. And she learned, come to those classes, there should be only one God, no graven image. And through that, and through the years, these children were hearing these stories. Well, during that time, again, another team saw the ministry and said, we want to be a part of that. How can we be involved? And I said, well, besides you praying and doing what you're doing now, maybe if you could help us get a house. There are 2 seasons in Central America, rainy and dry. And I knew once the dry season was up, it would be raining, and we would be out there trying to have these classes or had to not have class. And so they said, oh, we want to be a part of that. So they helped us rent a house, and we were able to use that house to have the Bible classes in for the children. Well, several weeks into that, the women said, well, now we want our groups to have training and classes. I said, well, all right, come on. And so we started training our women, and the WMU groups would come in, and they would have their regional meetings. Well, the men got jealous. Then they said, okay, hermano Pastor Randy, what are you going to do for our group? So he started bringing his pastors into the house. And so every week there was just all these classes going and training, because that's what we wanted. We wanted the work to be in the hands of the nationals. And I know that one of the things that was on our hearts during that whole time was, oh God, when we go back to stateside assignment, what's going to happen to this ministry? Please raise up leadership to take over this ministry. And so I'm going to let Randy share a little bit about.
In 1998, some of you remember Hurricane Mitch came through, and it just did a real number on the infrastructure of not just Honduras, but Nicaragua and a lot of the Central America area. And so they moved the work into a second level of the church that we had talked about before, Nazareth, into the clinic. And we were trying to help them develop what we called a family ministry center. And Cindy actually came up with a great title for it, Centro Promesas, or Promise Center, that would serve as a place for not only the children, but for the mothers and for the families and for the WMU, the ladies groups, and for the pastors and the teachers. When we were on furlough in 98, a group from Memphis called Pro Mission came to me, and they said, we've had somebody donate, and it was quite a sum of money, to build a building, and we don't know what to build. We heard you're doing work in Honduras. Do you know of a building that needs to be built? And I said, yes. We need a Promise Center built. And so actually the thing turned out that I'd said we were in Costa Rica, Honduras, Nicaragua. It was 99 when we went back to the field that the board moved us from Honduras to Nicaragua. But for 5 weeks I would travel back to Honduras, see the volunteer teams come in, put them to work, put them to task, and they began building what would be called the Promise Center. We weren't there. Ralph and Sue by this time had retired, but they had been actively involved in the life and ministry of these people, and we wanted to see this vision brought about. And so after 5 weeks, they had it finished as far as enclosed in the building, but still a lot needed to be done. We didn't know if it was going to continue on or not. That was 20 years ago. Well, it did continue on.
So this year, my youngest daughter, Christina, and I were able to go back to Honduras. Now, she had not seen these little playmates that she had played with and learned the language with and lived with in the streets. And so we were able to go back and see some of these friends all grown up, and that is Christina. And on the second picture, you'll see Gisela and Christina. And Gisela was
the same Gisela
that had come to me and had asked these questions that she was learning in Bible class. And she is now part of an active church in Tegucigalpa and raising her children to know the Lord. And so many of our children came to know the Lord, and they've scattered out through other parts of the world now, and they're carrying. We just don't know when we say, God, here am I, what those concentric circles, what they're going to do. Is just like that stone in the water, and it just ripples out, and it just keeps going for eternity. And so it just, stepping off the plane and seeing that face of that little girl all grown up, and I cried half the time I was there. I told them I was a bien llorona, which means I was just a crybaby all over the place, because every time I'd see someone new and just see how they were doing, it just blessed my heart over and over and over again. But she was one of those. And then
there was a new face, though, And the new face was somebody that God brought into the picture, because as Cindy and Christina were preparing this trip, their host got sick with COVID. And we had no idea who would receive them, how would they get from the airport, who would be responsible for them for their time there. And God brought in Pastor Osvaldo, who was pastor of another church, not a Baptist church, but one of our Baptist sister churches in Texas had just done a volunteer trip with Pastor Osvaldo, gave us his contact information, we Skyped him, and he was more than happy to receive Cindy and Christina, pick them up at the airport, and take them everywhere they needed to go.
And many of those places involved visiting again children that had been in our Bible class, as I mentioned earlier, on the left picture there, Martha and her kids all grown up.
That was our neighbors.
And that was our neighbors, and now they're still living in the same house. And then China, the one that I'm hugging over there, and she's so active in her church and different ministries. Again, it's just how God is using their lives even today. And then across the street, visiting with this man ran a little store called a Pulperia. And we would send Christina or one of the children to go and get maybe some milk. This little store they put in their little front room. And they'd go buy milk. And so Hermano Chono and his family would buy from them. And this past year, when he saw us walk up, we just wept, because that man had lost his wife to COVID, but before that he had lost his only daughter in childbirth. And he saw Christina, he said, "Ay, mi tiernita," which means my young one. That man is very Catholic, but when he saw Christina, he let her tell him all over again the gospel. So we spent several visits going back to him and talking to him to encourage his heart in the Lord. And he just felt so alone. But again, it's just, you just don't know what, when you say to God, "Here I am, use me," go, just let him use you in those different ways. And so it encouraged his heart. The church you see here, actually, this was our home church that we went to in San Lorenzo. It's called Esmirna. You would know it in English as Smyrna. It did not look like that. It was just a one-room little church with little classes on the side.
But it too had grown.
But it had grown too, so we were able to visit there. Again, I was going to enjoy that food everywhere I went. So again, we had those rice and beans and tortillas and enjoying the culture, Honduran food. As I mentioned before, Catholicism is still very strong, although the missionaries have really left their imprint there, and evangelism is going strong. And I want to say that because one of the pastors that Randy worked with, Pastor Federico and his family, I don't know.
Well, Pastor Federico was in Pavana, and I did a lot of work with their churches, did a lot of training with him personally, and he still communicates with me on social media. I get messages from him on Instant Messenger and even phone calls sometimes. There are some Honduran pastors that still reach out to us from the time that we've had.
We mentioned that the host family that we were supposed to stay with had gotten COVID. Now, we're visiting at their houses the day right before they get to come out of quarantine. So she still had me meet her at the gate, And and her daughter-in-law and her grandchild, they live in the little house behind them. And it's amazing because they always try to keep their families close, either building up on their homes or within the same area. And so we were able to visit with them, but I want to share a little bit about a ministry that Christina had started earlier this year, and it was so important to be able to meet with them. She started a ministry called Pan y Peces, which means fish and bread. And it was a ministry that was carried out through the Peniel Baptist Church, and it was bringing relief to many of the families. When COVID hit, in their country, they were not allowed to leave their home. And when I say they were not allowed, their military is used for many things. And their military carries their AK-47s wherever they go. So they guard banks, they guard grocery stores. You get used to it and you're very thankful they're there. Well, they also made sure that you stay home and out of the street, and you didn't leave until it was your day. And they had their own little identity cards, cedulas, and they had a number, and they could leave and go get food. Well, Christina, we learned about this. Marlene was sharing about how there were so many hungry families in their church, over 95 families. And so she took hold of the vision, gave it a name, and prayed about it. And so First Baptist in Trenton, Salem Baptist, we partnered together and was able for several months to send funds so that they could put together food bags and continue the ministry. And on the days they were allowed to go out, they could go and pass these food bags. And it just really brought some of these families through some tough times. Hermano Faustino, Brother Faustino, he's pastor of Peniel. Again, it was just so good to see these brothers and sisters. Amazing how no matter where you are in the world, because you know the Lord Jesus Christ and you share in just loving God, they become like family. It doesn't matter which language they speak. But Faustino wanted to tell me all about what their church was doing, what a blessing that Pani Pace's project had been, but also wanted to show me some vision for his church. These grassy areas right beside this brick wall, that they want to turn that into a fellowship hall. They want to build more Sunday school classes. Their church is just exploding. God's just doing amazing things, and so he wanted to show me what could be done as we begin to maybe put together volunteer teams and see what maybe 2023 we can put together. But I want to focus in on the Promise Center that Randy had mentioned, that Pro Missions had been a part of building the building. And when I met with Marlene, I wanted to see, of course, the building. They had also added some classrooms and had really made some nice bathrooms. And it was so funny because when they took me on, Christina and I, on tour of the Promise Center, and we had seen the building, but it expanded a little bit. Oh, they wanted to show us their new bathrooms. They were just, it was amazing, I have to say, because they were coming from outdoors, outhouses, to inside, and was actually tiled and very nice. Actually nicer than Walmart, I would say, probably. But it was just so sweet that they were so proud of how God. But what really touched my heart, they wanted to bring what we call the directiva. This is the leadership of the Promise Center and of the association, the Southern Association. That began with over 300 children. And these folks, the younger ones didn't even know the story. And Marlene says, oh, we're going to fix that. She said, you're going to come and you're going to tell the story of how the Promise Center came about. And they began, and Christy and I shared all these things, and they began to tell us what they were doing. The classes they were having for training their pastors, the evangelism for the children, what you know is Children's Evangelism Fellowship. They have their own version of that. To have, again, this is a meeting area for all these guys. The youth come in. There's so much going on. They had their first wedding back a couple of years ago, so now they offer it as a place for people to come and have their Christian wedding. They had their first funeral there this past year of one of the sisters in the church. So they're using it and utilizing this building so many ways. And of course, they want to take us around and show us what the projects are for the future, what they hope to accomplish. And of course, I'm sitting here saying, okay, now I want to hear what your vision is for the work. Because I was so excited that these nationals, after 20 years, picked up and ran with it. They have grown, and now the funds they've used to expand this group with their churches, over 53 churches, I think now they said. They have come together. They have provided the funds. They have collected so that they could put these extra spaces onto the building, but they need more help, and we were there to share and find out what that was. Walter, who is president of the whole Association of the South, that's in the black shirt, standing by Marlene in the red, he had never heard the story. He was 30-something years old. He didn't know who the missionaries were. He was a kid. So sharing this about what Ralph and Sue, our mentors, and then our family, and then missionary families all over Honduras, what they were doing. But that was a reflection, folks, of what God is doing all around the world. So when you pray, now you can see faces with these requests. Of course, they look different now. Ralph and Sue this summer passed away. Christine and I were able to go. Actually, they passed away within 11 days of each other. We were able to go to a double funeral and hear the stories that these folks had invested in the lives of these Hondurans, and then to see our pictures on the wall, and I just was so humbled that they would remember, and they wanted their youth and everyone to hear. But I stand before you, Randy and I both stand before you, and ask that you please continue to pray. See these missionaries as human beings who need your encouragement. To pray that God will give them protection and wisdom and strength and all that they need. And give from your heart during this time, knowing that every penny that you give toward this Lottie Moon Christmas offering is going to go to the field. It does not stay for overhead. 100% goes to those missionaries. But most of all, be praying and thinking about the people that it reaches, these kids that grow up and become adults, and the word just multiplies out there. And then saying to God, whether you're in this community here or going out there, wherever God calls you, be faithful. Just say, God, I don't know where you're going to use me or how. And maybe you can't go out there, but you can go here. You can go around Medina. You can go where God sends you. But pray and give and go. Be available, be open to what God is doing in this church.
I didn't know how to share about Lottie Moon when I hadn't been on the field for 20 years. It seemed like a closed chapter, but it's not a closed chapter, not in our lives. And this year, Cindy being able to go back and see how it has continued in our absence, there's no more greater joy than for somebody to see that you worked themselves out of a job and that the Nationals kept it going, and the Nationals keep it going. But I want you to know that 30-something years ago, when you were giving to Lottie Moon, you helped all this get started. And you're doing the same thing today. The Harrisons, who were on the field with us in Honduras, who are still on the field in Mexico. Your Lottie Moon Christmas offering made what you just saw tonight possible 20 years ago. It's still working today. And you can make that kind of difference in these kinds of lives all around the world. Thank you for letting us share this with you. It's been a long time since we did something like this together. And I'm sorry you didn't get to hear us sing. Well, not really. Would you pray with me?